John had always been a man of routine. He woke up early every day, brewed his coffee, and sat by the kitchen table, reading the news while his wife, Emily, prepared breakfast. They were the picture of middle-class suburban life. 2 kids, a modest home with a picket fence, and a love story that had been built over the years, layer by layer. They had met in college, both freshmen, both nervous and unsure about their futures. They had gotten married young, and while their love had always been intense, they had grown older together, weathering the storm of life with mutual respect, compromise, and the occasional fight. But there were things about Emily that John had never questioned, things he had never considered to be a problem. Emily was beautiful, smart, and independent. Qualities he admired, but also qualities that seemed to have caused a slow, invisible distance between them over the years. As the years passed, their conversations grew shorter, their laughs less frequent, and their intimacy more mechanical. They were still a family, still good friends, but something had shifted in the air, something John couldn't quite put his finger on. It all started innocuously enough, like so many stories of betrayal do. Emily started working late more often. At first, it was just a few evenings here and there, the late hours of her job at the marketing firm she worked for, but then it began to increase. She would come home late, sometimes with a tired smile, sometimes with a distracted look in her eyes. She would brush off his questions about her day, saying it had been stressful or she was just exhausted. John, tired from his own work as a lawyer, didn't question it too much. He had his own long hours to contend with, after all. But there were other signs. Little things that John began to notice over time. The extra makeup on her vanity that she hadn't used in years. The new perfume he'd never smelled before. And her phone, which she would suddenly be glued to in the evenings, screen down and often buzzing with notifications. He tried to dismiss it. She was just busy. She was just stressed. They had been together for so long. He trusted her. Then came the first time John saw a text message that made his heart race. It was late one evening when he walked into the living room to see Emily sitting on the couch, her head buried in her phone. She didn't notice him standing there at first, but when she looked up, her expression quickly shifted to something between nervousness and guilt. "Hey, what's up?" she said, a little too quickly. John felt a sudden chill. "Who's that?" he asked, motioning toward her phone. "Just a co-worker," Emily replied, but the tightness in her voice betrayed her. John tried to shake off the feeling, telling himself it was nothing, but a small seed of doubt had been planted. The next morning, he couldn't help himself. He picked up her phone while she was getting ready for work. The messages weren't from a co-worker. They were from a man named Jason, a man he didn't recognize, someone Emily had been texting for weeks, maybe longer. The messages were flirtatious at first, and then more intimate as time went on. Jason was sending her emojis, compliments about how beautiful she was, how he couldn't wait to see her again. The last message he saw was one that made John's blood run cold. "I'll pick you up at 7 tonight. I can't wait to be with you, Em." John felt a hot surge of anger and confusion flood his chest. He dropped the phone back onto the counter and stood there, frozen, his mind racing. The betrayal was so raw, so sudden, that he didn't know what to do. Part of him wanted to confront her immediately, but another part of him was paralyzed by the sheer shock of it. What happened to the Emily he had known? The woman he married, the mother of his children, the woman who had promised to love him, forsaking all others. Later that day, Emily came home late as usual, and John could tell she was avoiding him. He could sense her unease, the way she moved around him as if she were walking on eggshells. When she kissed him goodbye, she was quick, almost mechanical, her lips soft but her touch distant. "Are you okay?" John asked, his voice calm but laced with underlying tension. "I'm fine," Emily replied, her eyes avoiding his. "I've just got a lot on my plate right now." John nodded, but inside he felt like everything was unraveling. That night after their kids were asleep, he couldn't keep it in anymore. Emily, I need to know the truth, John said, his voice low, almost trembling. What are you talking about? She asked, clearly caught off guard. I know about Jason, John replied flatly, his voice edged with hurt and disbelief. He watched her face turn pale, her eyes widening. For a moment there was silence, a thick, suffocating silence. Then Emily spoke. I didn't want you to find out this way, she whispered, her voice trembling. I've been seeing him for the past 3 months. The words hit John like a physical blow. He felt his chest tighten, his throat constricting as he processed what she had just confessed. Why? Why would you do this? I don't know, Emily said, her voice cracking. I've felt so distant from you lately, John, so alone. It wasn't like I planned it. Jason, he made me feel alive again. I needed something, anything, to make me feel wanted. Wanted? John repeated, his voice rising. You have a family, Emily. You have me. And you've been betraying me behind my back. Emily broke down in tears, her shoulders shaking. I never meant to hurt you, John. I just didn't know how to fix it. I didn't know how to come back to you. I didn't know how to tell you what was happening in my heart. John stood there, feeling a mix of anger and heartbreak. His mind was spinning, trying to make sense of it all. He loved her. But this was something he couldn't overlook. The trust they had built was shattered, and he wasn't sure if it was something they could ever rebuild. For days, they didn't talk much. Emily begged him for forgiveness, but John wasn't sure he could ever forgive her. The thought of her with another man, of the intimacy they had shared now being replaced by someone else, gnawed at him like a slow, relentless poison. John tried to move past it, tried to stay civil for the sake of their children, but every time Emily smiled at him, every time she touched him, all he could see was the image of her with Jason. His mind replayed the betrayal over and over, a constant reminder that his wife, the woman he trusted, had found solace in someone else's arms. Months passed, and though John and Emily continued to live under the same roof, the walls between them grew thicker. The love they had once shared was now a shadow, a memory they couldn't seem to reclaim. They went through the motions of a marriage, of raising their children together, but something essential was gone. And though they tried therapy, and though Emily apologized countless times, John couldn't bring himself to trust her again. And so, life continued. A quiet, painful existence, where love was no longer the foundation. In the silence of their home, both of them were haunted by the same question. Could they ever return to what they once had, or was this betrayal the end of their story? This story explores the deep emotional complexities of infidelity and how it can irreparably alter the dynamics of a relationship. It's about betrayal, forgiveness, and the painful road to healing or possible separation. The days bled into weeks, and the weeks dragged on with an oppressive heaviness that settled over John and Emily's home. Their conversations, once warm and filled with shared jokes, were now mere exchanges of necessity. They spoke about the kids, about bills, about the mundane tasks of daily life. But the spark that once fueled their marriage had long since been extinguished. John found himself walking around in a daze. He had always been a man who took pride in his ability to face challenges head-on, to solve problems with logic and reason. But this was beyond him. Every time he looked at Emily, his heart clenched. He couldn't escape the image of her in the arms of another man, of her laughter shared with someone who wasn't him. He couldn't ignore the bitterness that had slowly taken root in his chest, spreading like a disease. Emily, too, felt the weight of her betrayal every day. She saw the change in John, the quiet distance that had grown between them. His eyes, once filled with warmth and affection, were now guarded, distant, like a man lost in his own thoughts. She missed the way he used to look at her, the the way he held her when they were alone. Now, even when they were in the same room, they felt like strangers. She had tried everything she could think of to fix it. She apologized endlessly, begged for forgiveness, went to therapy on her own. She even tried to rekindle their intimacy, but it was never the same. Every touch felt forced, every kiss awkward, as if they were trying to reconnect, but couldn't quite find the right way back. She knew she had destroyed something irreplaceable, but Emily also knew something she hadn't fully understood before. Forgiveness wasn't always something that could be given. Sometimes it had to be earned, and even then, it might never fully heal the wound. One night, after another therapy session that left them both exhausted, Emily came home to find John sitting alone in the living room. He was staring blankly at the television, but his mind seemed miles away. His hands were clasped tightly together, and there was a hardness in his posture that she hadn't seen in years. "I'm sorry, John," she whispered, her voice quiet, almost afraid to break the fragile silence between them. She had said those words so many times, but they felt hollow now. Did they even mean anything anymore? John didn't respond immediately. He continued to stare at the screen, his face impassive. Emily took a step closer, her heart pounding in her chest. "I don't know what to do anymore," she said, her voice cracking. "I've tried everything. I don't want to lose you, John. Please. I need you to tell me how to fix this." John finally turned to look at her, his eyes searching hers. But there was no warmth there, no flicker of recognition. It was as if the man she had loved for so long had vanished behind a wall of hurt. His words were slow, deliberate, as if he were speaking through a fog. "Emily, I want to believe you," he said quietly. "I really do, but I don't know if I can. Every time I look at you, I can't stop seeing him. I can't stop thinking about what you did and how you kept it from me. How you lied." His words hit her like a physical blow. She took a step back, a sob escaping her chest. "I never meant to hurt you," she whispered, tears streaming down her face. "I was so lost, so unhappy, and I didn't know how to talk to you about it. I didn't know how to fix us. I was selfish." John stood up, his face hardening. "You were selfish, Emily. You broke us. You didn't just break my trust, you broke the family. You broke me." His voice trembled slightly, but he swallowed hard, trying to hold back the flood of emotion threatening to spill over. He had been holding it in for so long, the anger, the pain, the humiliation. And now it was all coming out, raw and unfiltered. "I can't keep doing this," he said, his voice low. "I can't keep pretending like everything is fine when it's not. I can't look at you and forget what happened. I can't erase what you've done to me." Emily stood frozen, her heart sinking with every word. She wanted to reach out to him, to hold him, to beg him to stay, but she knew deep down that she had no right to ask for that anymore. She had already taken too much from him. She had already shattered the trust they had spent years building. "I don't want to lose you," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I love you. I love you more than I can ever explain, and I will spend the rest of my life trying to make up for what I've done." John closed his eyes, his fists clenched at his sides. He wanted to believe her. He wanted to forgive her, but something in him kept pulling him back, reminding him of the man she had been with, the lies, the secrets. He had seen too much, felt too much, to pretend like everything could go back to the way it was. "I don't know if I can forgive you, Emily," he said quietly, his voice breaking. I don't know." She stood there, broken, tears streaming down her face. She had no answers, no magic words that could undo the hurt she had caused. She had hurt him in a way that couldn't be undone with apologies or promises. She had crossed a line, and now she had to live with the consequences. That night, Emily lay in bed beside him, but the space between them felt wider than it had ever been. There was no intimacy, no connection, only the quiet hum of the ceiling fan and the distant sound of John's shallow breathing. They both knew that the love they had shared was gone, and neither of them knew how to bring it back. Days turned into weeks, and the tension in their home grew unbearable. Emily tried to make small gestures, cooking dinner, cleaning the house, trying to engage in conversation. But John was always distant, always lost in his own thoughts. There were moments when he would look at her, his eyes softening for just a second, and she would think maybe, just maybe, they could find a way back. But those moments were fleeting, and they were always followed by the cold silence that had become their reality. John, too, struggled. He still loved Emily. Part of him always would. But he couldn't get past the betrayal. He couldn't forget what she had done, how she had allowed another man to take his place. Every time he saw her, he felt the betrayal like a knife twisting in his gut. Finally, after months of living in this painful limbo, John made a decision. It wasn't something he came to lightly, but he knew deep down that he couldn't keep living this way. He couldn't keep pretending that everything was fine when it wasn't. "Emily," he said one night, his voice quiet but firm. "I think it's time we take a break. I need time. I need space. I need to figure out who I am again and what I want." Emily looked at him, her face pale, her lips trembling. She had known this moment was coming, but hearing him say it out loud still felt like a punch to the gut. "I understand," she whispered, her heart breaking with every word. "I love you, John, and I'll always love you, but I know I can't make you love me again. Not after everything I've done." And with that, the quiet, painful unraveling of their marriage began in earnest. Neither of them knew what the future held. Would they ever find their way back to each other? Or would the wounds of the past be too deep to heal? For now, they both had to live with the silence. The space that had once been filled with laughter, love, and warmth, now replaced by an emptiness that neither of them knew how to escape. The weeks after John and Emily decided to take a break were a blur of pain, loneliness, and reflection. John moved into the spare bedroom, though the house was still their shared home. Every morning he would wake up early, lingering in the silence before he got out of bed. He felt like a ghost in his own life, existing in the space between the man he used to be and the man he had become since Emily's betrayal. Emily, too, found herself adrift. The house that had once felt like a sanctuary now felt hollow. The walls were filled with memories of happier times, moments she had taken for granted. And now, they were just reminders of what she had lost. She spent her days working from home, trying to find some sense of normalcy, but her thoughts often drifted back to John. Was there any chance they could rebuild? Was there a way to fix the unfixable? She'd stopped seeing Jason after John found out. She had ended things the moment she realized how deep the damage went. It had been an escape, a fleeting moment of affection that, in hindsight, seemed so trivial compared to the devastation it caused. But the damage had been done. No amount of apologies or regret could take back the hurt. Days stretched into weeks, and despite their mutual attempts at avoidance, the tension in the house only grew. Emily had given John space, just as he had asked, but it seemed to make things worse. The silence was suffocating. They spoke only when necessary, about bills, about the children, about the mundane. But there was nothing left between them, not really. Emily felt like she was living in a house of mirrors, constantly confronted by the reflection of her failure. John, on the other hand, wrestled with his emotions. He had tried to suppress the pain, telling himself that time would heal. But time only seemed to deepen the wound. He had moments where he felt angry, betrayed beyond repair, and moments where he felt empty, unsure if he even wanted to try anymore. The idea of reconciliation felt like a distant dream, but so did the thought of truly letting go. His children depended on him, and his family still meant everything to him. But the question loomed in his mind. Could he ever truly forgive Emily? Could he ever trust her again? One evening, as the sun set behind the trees in their backyard, Emily sat alone on the porch, staring out at the horizon. She wasn't sure what she was hoping for, maybe for some sign, some revelation that would tell her what to do. She couldn't keep living like this, and yet she didn't know how to move forward. She missed John terribly, but how could she ask him to forgive her? Was forgiveness even possible after what she had done? As she sat there, lost in thought, she heard the door open behind her. She turned to see John standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Can we talk?" he asked, his voice quiet but firm. Emily stood up immediately, her heart racing. This could be the moment they finally said everything that had been left unsaid. Or it could be the end. She wasn't sure, but she knew she had to face whatever was coming. She nodded, her throat tight. Of course. They walked inside, the familiar scent of their home lingering in the air, though it felt distant now. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared countless meals, laughed, and talked for hours before life had become so complicated. John took a deep breath, as if he were gathering the courage to speak. His eyes met hers, and for a moment she saw the man she had loved, the man she had hurt so deeply. His voice was steady, but there was a tremor in it that she hadn't heard in months. "I've been thinking a lot about us," John began. "About everything, about the mistakes I made, and about what you did. I don't know if I'll ever fully understand why you did it, but I think I've finally come to a realization." Emily's heart pounded in her chest. Was he going to ask for a divorce? Was he going to tell her he was done? "I can't just forget what happened," he continued, his eyes searching hers. "And I can't pretend like it didn't break me. But I've been thinking about what you said, about how you were unhappy, how you felt distant from me. I've been thinking about that a lot." Emily's breath hitched and she nodded. "And I was wrong, John. I've hurt you in a way I can never take back, but I swear I didn't want to hurt you. I just didn't know how to fix things, and I was too scared to talk to you." John paused, his gaze shifting to the window as he seemed to gather his thoughts. "I get that. I understand that. I've been thinking about it, too. We were both lost, Emily. We both let our lives slip into this routine, this indifference. I didn't see it either, and maybe, in a way, I failed you, too. I should have noticed sooner." Emily's chest tightened. "I didn't want anyone else. I wasn't looking for anyone else. I was looking for a way out." John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I don't know, but I think we need to start over. We need to figure out how to move forward, separately but together. Maybe we can't fix everything, but we can try." Emily's heart fluttered, the weight of his words settling in. It wasn't a guarantee, but it was a chance they hadn't had in months. "I'll do whatever it takes, John. I just need a chance to prove that I'm sorry, that I'm worth it." John met her gaze, his eyes searching hers. The silence hung between them for a long moment, filled with 1,000 unspoken words. Finally, he nodded. "Maybe we can try," he said, his voice quieter now. "But it's going to take time. We need to rebuild trust, Emily. And that doesn't happen overnight. Are you ready for that?" She nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I'm ready. I'll do whatever it takes." It wasn't a happy ending, not yet, and maybe it never would be. But for the first time in months, they both saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to rebuild, not to erase the past, but to find a way to live with it and move forward. They had a long road ahead, one full of hard conversations and painful moments, but as they sat across from each other, there was a small flicker of something resembling the love they once shared. It was fragile, but it was there, waiting to be nurtured, and that in itself felt like a new beginning. This continuation shows that while trust and healing may take a long time, the decision to try again can open a door to new possibilities. The story isn't about erasing the past, but about accepting it and taking the first steps toward something different, with patience and commitment. They exchanged small smiles, and though the air was still thick with tension, there were moments of warmth. They would sit together on the porch, watching the sunset, without words, but with the quiet understanding that they were trying. Emily had stopped apologizing every 5 minutes, and John had stopped expecting everything to be fixed in a day. They were beginning to rebuild trust in small, almost imperceptible ways. But even as they started this new chapter, there were still shadows in their home. They were no longer the same people who had fallen in love years ago, and neither of them was sure if they could ever go back to that version of their marriage. Every step they took forward seemed to come with a shadow of doubt, a fear that one wrong move would tear them apart again. There were nights when John would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning if he could ever fully trust her again. There were days when Emily would watch him, his back turned to her, and wonder if he was faking it, pretending to be okay when he was really still hurting. But both of them were learning to give each other the space to heal, even if it was in small, quiet moments. One night, months after their decision to try again, John returned home late from one of his evening walks. The air was cool, and there was a calm stillness to the night. He had been thinking deeply about everything, about Emily, about their family, about the future. He could feel the weight of his emotions pressing down on him, the exhaustion of trying to reconcile what had been lost with the hope of what could be. As he walked through the door, he found Emily sitting at the kitchen table, a mug of tea in her hands. She looked up at him, her eyes soft but tired, as though she had been waiting for him to come home. "How was your walk?" she asked, a small smile tugging at her lips. John paused for a moment, still standing in the doorway, watching her. His heart seemed to beat in rhythm with the silence between them, a silence that had become familiar, almost comfortable. It wasn't the silence of avoidance anymore, but the silence of two people living side by side, unsure but trying to make something out of nothing. "It was good," he said finally, stepping into the room. "I've been thinking." "About what?" Emily's voice was gentle, but there was a nervous edge to it, as if she feared that the subject of their conversation would once again tear open old wounds. "About us," he replied. "About what we've been through." Emily's breath caught in her throat. She set her tea down on the table and looked at him, her heart in her eyes. She wasn't sure if he was going to tell her he was done, or if he had finally come to a decision. But she was bracing herself either way. "Emily," John said, his voice steady, "I can't promise that everything will go back to the way it was. I can't forget what happened, and I don't think we'll ever be the same people we were before. But I've been thinking about the future, and I don't want to let this destroy us. I don't want to live the rest of my life regretting that I didn't try to rebuild this, to rebuild us." Emily's eyes filled with tears, but this time they were tears of relief. She had feared for so long that John's hurt would be too deep to overcome, that he would never be able to move past the betrayal. But as she looked at him now, she saw something different in his eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but the willingness to keep trying, to keep fighting. "I'm not asking you to forgive me right now," Emily whispered. "I'm not asking you to pretend like everything is okay, but I am asking you to give us a chance. To give me a chance to prove that I'm not the same person I was." John looked at her for a long time, his gaze unwavering. Then slowly, he nodded. "I'm willing to try, but we're going to take this one day at a time, and it's not going to be easy." "I know," Emily replied, her voice barely audible. "But I'll take one day at a time with you, John, if you'll let me." And so they began again. Not with grand gestures, Not with fireworks, but with small steps, with an open willingness to confront their past and face their future together, however uncertain it might be. The road ahead was still full of challenges, full of moments where the past threatened to creep in, but they had taken the first real step toward healing. They didn't know if they would succeed, if their marriage would ever be what it once was, but they knew one thing for sure. They were no longer trapped in the silence of their shared pain. They were speaking again, listening again, and that alone felt like a victory. For now, that was enough. Months passed, and John and Emily's journey of rebuilding continued, slow and painstaking, but still moving forward. They had become accustomed to the quiet rhythm of their days, the ebb and flow of their lives together, without the tumult of anger or the weight of betrayal hanging over them. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but something had shifted in their relationship, an understanding that things would never be the same, but that they could still create something new, something different, based on what they had learned about themselves and each other. John found himself becoming more patient, not just with Emily, but with himself. The healing process was not linear, and some days were harder than others. There were still flashes of anger and betrayal, moments when memories of the affair would surge up like a wave, threatening to pull him under. But he had learned to sit with those feelings, to let them pass, rather than allowing them to consume him. He knew that trust would not be restored overnight, but every small step they took, every honest conversation, every gesture of care, was one step closer to rebuilding what had been broken. Emily, too, had started to heal in ways she hadn't anticipated. Therapy had been an eye-opening experience for her, revealing deep-seated insecurities and unresolved fears that had led her to make destructive choices. She had come to understand that her affair with Jason hadn't been about love, but about escaping the discomfort of facing the cracks in her marriage. She wasn't proud of what she had done, and she still struggled with the guilt of betraying John. But she was learning to accept that she couldn't change the past, only the present and future. And that meant continuing to prove, through her actions, that she was committed to the man she had once loved and hoped to love again. Their conversations, once filled with awkward pauses and unspoken resentment, had slowly become more honest, more real. They would sit together at the kitchen table after dinner, sharing stories about their day, asking about each other's thoughts and feelings, without the weight of silence pressing down on them. They began to laugh together again, and the simple moments, a touch on the shoulder, a shared glance across the room, started to feel like the beginnings of something new, something worth fighting for. Yet, despite the strides they had made, the past still loomed over them. Emily still struggled with her self-worth. She would catch herself second-guessing every smile, every kind gesture from John, wondering if he was truly okay or if he was simply pretending to be. The fear of not being enough for him, of always being remembered as the one who had betrayed him, still haunted her, even in the quiet moments when everything seemed to be okay. One afternoon, as John returned from another walk, he found Emily sitting at the porch swing, a notebook in her lap, her gaze distant. It wasn't unusual for her to be lost in thought, but there was something about the way she was sitting there that made him pause. The uncertainty, the sadness that still lingered in her eyes, was something he hadn't seen in a while. He walked toward her, his footsteps deliberate, and as he reached the bottom of the stairs, she looked up at him, as though startled by his approach. "Hey," he said softly, his voice warm, trying to bridge the gap that always seemed to exist between them, even now. "Everything okay?" Emily took a breath, glancing down at the notebook in her lap. She hadn't expected him to notice, or maybe she hadn't expected him to care anymore. The thought of opening up about the fear and doubt she still carried felt heavy in her chest. But something in the way he was looking at her made her want to share, to be honest, to let him see the parts of her that she had hidden. "I've been thinking," she began, her voice shaky, unsure of how to frame what she was feeling. "About everything. About us." John sat down beside her, his presence comforting yet charged with the gravity of their conversation. "What about us?" "I don't know," Emily said, her fingers tracing the edge of the notebook absent-mindedly. "I think I'm scared, John. Scared that you'll never really forgive me. That I'll always be the woman who betrayed you no matter what I do. That I'll never be enough." John felt a pang in his chest. He had seen her struggle with this before, but hearing her say it out loud made the weight of it even more real. For so long, he had carried the burden of his own hurt, of the wound she had inflicted on him. But now, sitting beside her, he realized how much she had been carrying too, how the guilt, the shame, was still eating at her. "Emily," he said gently, his voice soft but steady. "I don't know if I'll ever fully forget what happened. But I've been thinking about something. You're right. It's not just about forgiveness. And that's what we've been doing, isn't it? We're not the same people we were. And I can't pretend that things are just magically fixed. But we're here. Together. And that matters." Emily turned to face him, her eyes glistening with the weight of the words he had said. "I don't want to be the person who hurt you," she whispered. "I just want to be the person who can make it right, if that's even possible." "You already are," John said, reaching out to gently take her hand. "It's not about perfection, Emily. It's about being honest with each other and being willing to try even when it's hard. That's what matters." For a moment, they sat there in silence, their hands intertwined, the weight of their conversation hanging between them. The air was heavy with the past and the future, with all the uncertainties that came with it. But for the first time in a long while, Emily felt a sense of peace settle over her. She didn't have to be perfect. She didn't have to fix everything right now. She just had to keep trying. And John was willing to try with her. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a golden light across the yard, Emily felt a glimmer of hope. A quiet, fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, they could still find their way back to each other. Not to what they had before, but to something new, something stronger, built on the ashes of their past mistakes. It wasn't a fairy tale ending, but it was their story. And for the first time in a long time, Emily believed that they could still write it together. The next few months unfolded with more challenges, but also more moments of connection. John and Emily's relationship had evolved into something neither of them could have predicted when they first decided to try again. It wasn't easy, and there were still days when the weight of what had happened between them seemed unbearable. There were arguments, miscommunications, and moments when both of them felt like they were taking 2 steps forward and 1 step back. But something had changed. John, though still grappling with his trust issues, found himself letting go of the constant suspicion that had once consumed him. He no longer checked her phone or questioned her every move, though it took conscious effort. There were nights when memories of the affair crept into his mind, like dark shadows, but he learned to acknowledge them without letting them control him. It wasn't so much forgiveness as it was a decision to live beyond the past, a choice to focus on the present and the future, even when those shadows loomed. For Emily, there were moments when she thought she would never fully escape the grip of her guilt. Every now and then, she would catch a glimpse of John's face, the hurt still evident in his eyes, and it would feel like a blow to her chest. She had hurt him so deeply, and no matter how much she tried to prove herself, she feared she might never be enough to make up for it. But she had learned something important over the past few months. Forgiveness wasn't a destination. It was a journey, one she was taking step by step, even when it felt like she was barely moving. One evening, as they sat on the porch together after dinner, Emily noticed a quiet shift in the way John was looking at her. It was subtle, almost imperceptible, but it was there. A change in the way his gaze softened when their eyes met, the way his hand brushed against hers as they sat in silence. She felt the warmth of his touch, and for the first time in a long while, she felt hope bloom inside her chest. "I've been thinking," John said after a while, breaking the comfortable silence between them. "About what?" Emily asked, her voice soft, unsure of where the conversation was headed. "I don't know if I've ever really told you this," he began, his voice steady but thoughtful. "But I've been really proud of you, Emily. Proud of the way you've been working on yourself. Proud of how hard you've tried to make things right, even when it's been hard. I know it's not easy for you, and I know you're still carrying a lot of guilt. But I can see the effort. I can see how much you care." Emily's heart skipped a beat. His words were unexpected, yet they filled her with a warmth she hadn't felt in a long time. She looked at him, searching his face for any sign of insincerity, but there was none. This was John, her John, saying what she had longed to hear for so long. "I'm trying," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "But sometimes I still feel like I'll never be good enough, like I'll never be able to undo the damage I've done." John shook his head, his hand gently squeezing hers. "You don't need to undo anything, Emily. You're already doing the hardest part. You're being real with me, you're being honest with yourself, and you're working through the pain. That's all I can ask for." For the first time, Emily felt a small but significant shift within herself. It wasn't about erasing the past or becoming someone she wasn't. It was about acceptance. She didn't have to be perfect. She just had to keep showing up, keep being honest, and keep trying, and maybe that was enough. A few weeks later, John and Emily found themselves at a crossroads once again. Emily had been offered a promotion at work, a significant step forward in her career, one she had dreamed about for years. But the opportunity would require her to travel more, to spend more time away from home. As much as she wanted to take the job, there was a part of her that feared the distance would bring new tension into their already fragile relationship. John had been supportive of her career from the beginning, but this new opportunity felt different. He was proud of her accomplishments. But the thought of her being away more often stirred up a feeling of insecurity. Would the space between them create a new divide? Could they handle the strain of her absence? He didn't want to stand in the way of her growth, but the uncertainty gnawed at him. One evening, after Emily returned from a long day at work, John found her sitting in their living room, staring at the offer letter in her hands. He sat down beside her, waiting for her to speak. "I don't know what to do," Emily admitted, her voice heavy with indecision. "This is everything I've worked for, but I'm scared. I'm scared of what it might do to us." John sighed, his hand gently resting on hers. "We've been through a lot, Emily, and I don't want to stand in your way. I just don't know if we're ready for that kind of change." "I don't want to hurt us again," Emily said, her voice almost a whisper. "I don't want to get so caught up in my own ambitions that I lose what we've worked so hard to rebuild." John turned to face her, his expression more vulnerable than she had seen in a long time. "I'm scared, too," he confessed, "scared that the distance will make us drift apart. But I don't want you to stop pursuing your dreams for me. You've sacrificed a lot already, and I don't want to be the one holding you back." Emily looked at him, her heart swelling with gratitude. He was right. They had already come so far, and while she was still afraid of the unknown, she knew that they had learned to face their challenges together. The past might never completely fade, but the future was theirs to shape. "I'm not sure what the right answer is," Emily said after a long pause, "but I think we can make it work. We've been through so much already. If we keep communicating, if we keep being honest, then maybe the distance won't be so hard after all." John nodded slowly, his hand giving hers one last reassuring squeeze. "We'll figure it out, Emily. We'll take it one step at a time, just like we've been doing, and no matter what, we'll keep trying." The decision was made. Emily accepted the promotion, and while it brought a new set of challenges, it also brought a renewed sense of partnership between her and John. There were moments when the distance between them felt palpable, but they had learned to adjust, to make time for each other in new ways. They planned regular weekend getaways, and their phone calls became more than just mundane check-ins. They became moments of connection, where they talked not only about their days, but about their hopes, their fears, and their love for each other. Their marriage, once teetering on the edge of collapse, had transformed into something different. Not perfect, but real. They had faced the shadows of the past, and while they couldn't undo the mistakes that had been made, they had learned to walk forward together, with trust, understanding, and a willingness to continue growing, both as individuals and as a couple. And as they sat together side by side under the same sky they had shared for so many years, they realized that love wasn't just about the good times. It was about weathering the storms, rebuilding after the wreckage, and finding new ways to love each other, even when it felt impossible. For John and Emily, their story was no longer defined by betrayal or loss. It was a story of rebuilding, of second chances, and of a love that had been tested, but not broken. It was a story still unfolding, with no end in sight, only the promise of more days to come, together.